Panzer IIs, which were supposed to be there. A lot of the Panzer IIs were being used in place of Panzer IIIs in the light tank companies because there weren't enough Panzer IIIs to fill up all the required slots. And if you think about the Panzer II as basically an expanded Panzer I with a little bit more HE capability and the ability to reliably destroy light armor, you won't be too far off. It retains the problem of the one-man turret, although at least the TC can just stick his head out the top if he has to. Part of the expansion of the vehicle was room for the third crewman, who was the radio man, and he sits actually facing the radio officially and he to the rear, actually facing the radio man in the vehicle. Although, that said, the seat is actually reversible, so the radio operator could face forward, and in such a position, presumably, he could also help out with some of the loading functions of the turret. There were over 900 of these Panzer IIs in the French campaign, making them somewhere just over a third of the German tank force. Panzer I and II together made over half of the force. So, at first one may wonder how vehicles with their lighter armor and the one-man turrets can be compared to the French vehicles with their heavier armor and one-man turrets. Well, first, they were better coordinated, as radios, even if just receive only, are standard. Secondly, there is a French one-man turret and a German one-man turret, and the difference from inside is night and day. Trust me. Don't get me wrong, a one-man turret is still a significant problem in terms of combat, but at least the German ones take into account some reality of the fact that there's a bloke inside that needs to have general operating room and the ability to see outside. And as I said, even the diminutive little Panzer I is still quite comfortable. The crews are going to remain very fresh and alert for far longer than their opponents in their French counterpart vehicles. And of course, being fast and mobile and with radios, these vehicles could react very quickly, show up where they're not expected, and they were able to take rapid advantage of any opportunities that happened to show up. Plus, they were also usually fast enough to be able to get out of trouble if they got into it. The supposed main tank of the German army is the Panzer III, and I do have a video of that, although it is a later version with a 5cm gun. For the invasion of France, that vehicle was still under development because funding for the development of the gun was not approved until 1938, and it just hadn't entered service yet. But the tank was designed to be upgradable. A discussion on tank design by Vapor 6, the tank development arm, shall we say, of the Department of Munitions, made note of a couple of things even today often overlooked. For example, it observed that cross-country speed is limited not so much by engine power as it is by vision. The vehicles have to travel slowly enough that a crew can be confident of going cross-country and seeing obstacles before they fall into them, which also incidentally is why M18 units, the Hellcats, never quite made any particular mention of the tactical utility of the high speed of their vehicle because, well, ditches show up much faster. The big question that the designers had for the Panzer III was weight. Most bridging units of the German army had an 8-ton or an 18-ton capacity, and the Vapor 6 decided that, well, if you got to hold yourself to an 18-ton limit, armor thickness is less important than the tonnage required by the volume for speed, fuel, and the ability to divide combat tasks amongst the crew. That said, the French automatic 25mm anti-tank gun was considered a very serious threat, so there was little choice but to armor the tank to at least meet that. As a result, the Panzer IIIs, as seen in France, came in at a combat weight of about 19.5 tons combat loaded, and this stretched the ability of the 18-ton bridges to hold the weight. But you could still do it, kind of like circle exit, and you can save a quarter ton by getting 4 of the 5 crewmen to get out and walk. The result, though, out of all this was what I pretty much consider to be the best overall tank in the world in 1940. It was fast, it was reliable, it was welded, it had a proper 3-man turret with crew tasks divided up, it had excellent suspension, lots of room inside, and had working radios. Now, the vehicle was not flawless. Heavy maintenance would still be a chore, and the 37mm required either a lucky shot or Panzergranate 40 at close range to deal with a French tank, But those flaws were nowhere near enough to counter the capabilities of a tank which could be counted on to show up where you needed it, when you needed it, and was a threat to pretty much everything that it was likely to meet. Plus, if you were usually mobile enough and flexible enough, you could be where the French tanks weren't. The only problem, there weren't enough of them. In fact, there were barely 350. In comparison to the other tanks, though, they generally had an effect far beyond their raw numbers. To fill in the gap, fortunately, they had over 300 of the Czech Panzer IIIs. In early 1940, these were redesignated as the Panzer 35T and the Panzer 38T, by names by which we are now more familiar, but they were still fielded on the Panzer III basis of issue to the light tank companies. As a tank, they are not equal to the Panzer III, with a riveted construction and a two-man turret. And even at that, the vehicles were designed as actually one-man turret vehicles. The Germans, some consider that unacceptable, so somehow they managed to shoehorn a loader into it. On the other hand, the 37, as found on the 38T, was actually a touch more of a threat to French tanks. It was more powerful armor-piercing. And the vehicle, with its British design gearbox, was very easy to drive, had reasonable suspension, and was certainly an improvement over the Panzer IIs that were being used to fill in the other gaps of the Panzer III issue. Somewhere over 100 of the vehicles were the older 35T, leaving about 200 of the newer 38s. The vehicles were designed to resist 20mm fire, and only the front hulls of some of the vehicles had been up-armored by the time May of 1940 had rolled around. Rounding out the tank fleet, the much underappreciated Panzer IV. Designed as the Begleitwagen, an escort vehicle, it was not considered to have the same requirements of speed as the Panzer III, and hence you get the bogie suspension, and it only had a short little 7.5cm gun, mainly designed for infantry support, and not the most accurate thing in the world against a moving target, although certainly a tank would notice if it were hit by one. For a vehicle designed prior to World War II, it had an astonishing amount of upgradability, and outside of some of the earlier models being a little bit light on armor, there is very little negative that can be said about the tank, which filled out one medium company per tank battalion. Somewhere just shy of 300 Panzer IVs partook in the campaign. Fantastic vehicle, which would soon overtake the Panzer III as the best tank the Germans had, and was basically one of the best designs of the war if you consider its time of origin. In terms of self-propelled artillery, there were few options. No resources had been made available to make proper SPGs, although there was the intent to do so. There were 38 of the 15cm heavy infantry guns mounted onto a Panzer I chassis, which is very literally you take a conventional 15cm on a towed mount and you just crane it onto a Panzer I hull. As you can imagine, these were very effective in the assault gun role, if perhaps a little bit top heavy and slow. And they always went around with a half track to carry the ammo and some crewmen. The other assault gun, just arriving for its combat debut, is the Sturmgeschütz. Not very popular with the Panzer Corps, and it took rather a concerted effort by the artillery and infantry branches to overrule the tankers, who wanted all the production capacity available for their own branch. A total of 24 Stug A's with a whopping 5 centimeters of frontal armor took part in the campaign. But then again, for the Stugs, things only got better from there. Finally, the anti-tank guns, the PACs. And these were designed very much with the French Char B1 in mind. And it was realized that it could be questioned as to whether or not the standard 37mm anti-tank gun could deal effectively with these big monsters. Two solutions were fielded. The first was the 4.7cm PAC T on the Panzer I, later known as the Panzerjäger 1. The 47mm was ordered specifically for the vehicle and mounted on a Panzer 1B chassis with a large shield, somewhat reminiscent of the 15cm infantry gun variant, but for the Panzerjäger it was actually a purpose-designed mount, not just a jury-rigged thing. 18 vehicles were in operation when the invasion kicked off. They were all in a single battalion, but 3 other battalions joined in as they were fielded after a very, very short conversion course. Fortunately, the Panzer I was a known quality, so the hull was fine. And even whilst accepting that the vehicles were basically just bodges thrown together and that a purpose-designed vehicle would be far better, this proved to be a very popular system, and the gunners were very happy to engage French armour at ranges of over 500 meters. The manual for the tactical employment of these vehicles emphasizes their speed advantage over tanks, caused by their light armour, their superior vision, caused by open tops, and their use of mobility to engage enemy tanks by surprise. Doctrine said that they couldn't be engaged in less than company strength barring exceptional circumstances, and that on occasion an entire battalion would be preferable. When the unit that they were attached to would be attacking, they would be kept ready to deal with enemy tank attacks. This is almost word for word what the US decided would become the tank destroyer doctrine the following year. There was one last ace up the German sleeve for dealing with heavy enemy armour, the 8.8 centimeter. 4 anti-tank battalions had a heavy company with these guns. 3 of them were towed, and they were basically conversions of the AA gun modified for ground combat. The 4th had 6 self-propelled 8.8s mounted on 12-ton half-tracks, and this unit had seen service in Poland and then was also used in France. This company was the first heavy company of Panzerjäger Abteilung 8 and was attached to the 1st and 2nd Panzer Divisions. There were other towed 8.8s scattered around in the invasion. They were owned by the Luftwaffe, but in the entire French campaign, these units only claimed 9 enemy tanks destroyed. As a result, the vast majority of the enemy tanks that were destroyed by something other than the 8.8. Regardless of the reputation that the 8.8 had, even that early on in the war. We now move to the French side of the house, and we're going to again start with the personnel carriers. The French had a full-tracked APC, the Lorraine 38L, and just under 200 of these had been built by the fall of France, but they had not yet officially been issued to convert the mech battalions of the French armoured divisions, which were still right up to the outbreak of the war using half-tracks. The vehicles were as a result rather hurriedly and somewhat ad hoc distributed. And I'll come back briefly to the armoured divisions, but remember, go back to my doctrine video, a French armoured division is not what you would consider an armoured division in another country. This is basically a whole bunch of tanks all together and have a single battalion of infantry. The ad hoc distribution is something of an unfortunate truth for the French AFV production as a whole in the lead up to the invasion. And units were receiving the vehicles straight from the production line, occasionally incomplete and without the time available to learn them and learn their quirks and idiosyncrasies and how to use them well and what their strengths were and so on. The 38L was a derivative of the 37L, which is basically a tracked armoured supply vehicle designed to provide logistical support to the tanks, better than the trucks could provide. And similarly, the Renault UE, or the Chenilette, literally the little track, was also more of a tractor for other weapons than a weapon system in itself. For reconnaissance, the Automitrailleuse de Découverte was used, and this is the Panhard 178. It is a purpose-designed 4x4, has a very effective 25mm cannon, and one could expect 40 of them to be found in a division. The DLM and also the DIM providing long-range reconnaissance. Over 350 of them were built, and since it entered service in the mid-1930s, there had been plenty of time for the French to work at the kinks and get used to their vehicles. So arguably, this was the most effective vehicle that the French had as a result. Unfortunately, it was not a line combat vehicle, it's a scout car. Thus, the French could be assured that they would get the information, but the problem was that whether or not they received the information when and where it counted, and then act on it soon enough to count. And, well, as we would find out next week, perhaps you will discover that they didn't. Spoiler alert, I'm sorry if I spoiled the war for you. Also, technically a reconnaissance vehicle, but in reality more of a light tank, the AMRs 33 and 35. The AMR 33 is more or less the contemporary and equivalent to the Panzer I or the Mark IV Light over in the UK. Has a single machine gun in a one-man turret. It's a two-man crew overall. Very light armor, good for small arms only, but it is extremely fast. For what it was, the AMR wouldn't have been bad, but for the fact that it was horribly unreliable. Not much over 100 were in use in 1940. They ended up being in the cavalry divisions, but not the DLMs. For those, they were replaced by AMR 35s, which is a reconfigured vehicle. You put the engine at the back instead of at the front. It's more reliable, and a good number of these are equipped with 13.2mm machine guns instead of the smaller 7.5s. The French had figured out by 1940, though, that the days for these vehicles were also pretty much numbered, and they started being replaced by heavier vehicles, at least in the DLMs, the mechanized cavalry divisions. But about 150 or so of the AMR 35s could still be found in the DLMs, whilst others were sent to other units. The vehicle replacing them in the DLM was the Hotchkiss H-35. Now, it may be a little bit difficult to comprehend today, but at 28 kilometers an hour, they were considered to be a little bit too fast for the infantry. But more importantly, it wasn't actually all that easy to drive, and it was a bit on the expensive side. The DLMs, though, at this point should perhaps be mentioned that they're about as close to a panzer division as you would find outside of Germany. They're very powerful units. And the higher speed of the Hotchkiss appealed to the cavalry corps and its need for rapidly moving units which could screen the infantry units, the mechanized or motorized infantry units that were going into Belgium. Again, I refer you to the French Doctrine video. The upgraded or faster version, commonly known as the H-39, with almost double the horsepower, 120, that topped out at 38 kilometers an hour. Now, curiously enough, the way things worked out, the infantry turned out to be a major use of the H-39 after all, and they teamed it with the Char B-1s in the armored divisions. Although some of the H-39s did actually filter through to the cavalry as well. The H-35 was not the worst vehicle in the French military, and that is sayable because there is such a low bar set. It's a two-man tank, and the 4 centimeters of armor was probably its best feature. The gun certainly is not. It's a short little 37mm SA-18 of World War I vintage, and it lobbed such puny rounds that a hand grenade is probably more dangerous. There was an upgrade program started in early 1940 to increase the gun to the SA-38, higher velocity. The HE rounds weren't very much better, and you got about 100 meters per second gain of velocity, which means that the SA-38 is a threat to Panzer IIIs and IVs at close range. The problem, very few SA-38s were actually fielded, and the turret is absolutely horrendous. It's the same turret as found on the Renaults, and as I said, there are one-man turrets, and there are one-man turrets. It is cramped with the main gun, let alone the bigger, later gun with the bigger ammo, and the vision is absolutely horrendous. Platoon leaders usually had a radio, other tanks in the platoon usually did not. And in these things, it is difficult enough just figuring out where you were and where your buddies were, let alone finding and engaging the enemy. And this was a problem common to pretty much all French tanks. There was a two-man tank, the ACG, but very few of them were built. They were actually built for the Belgian army, and there was a couple that were in France, and they nicked them and they put them into service. The last armored vehicle to make note of for the cavalry is the S-35, and this one I have also done a video tour of over on my channel. And it is the only tank where auto-mitrailleuse de combat, only the infantry are allowed to have tanks, that I would consider even vaguely worthy of being called viable. And even at that, it's somewhat iffy. We have a 3-man crew, which, as usual, one is in the turret and can basically see nothing. He is the commander and the gunner. He may be assisted by the radio man, because since most S-35s didn't actually have a radio, he had absolutely nothing better to do than to kind of squeeze in underneath the 1.5-man turret and load the gun. The gun itself is excellent, the 47, but it is kind of pointless if you can't find the targets to aim it at. Going from head out to see out, because you got the hatch at the back, and then down to head down in the sight, you're going to take forever simply handing off a target to yourself. The suspension on the tank is okay. It's basically been stolen off of the Skoda 35. Although the front is kind of poorly designed, lacks obstacle crossing capability, and by the time a new design for that was out, the war was over, at least for France. The armor is also pretty reasonable. 4-piece cast hull being sloped, it's 4 centimeters, and the tank will go along at a good 40 kilometers an hour, most acceptable. Unfortunately, being part of the crash armament program just before the war kicked off, a lot of the units simply didn't have time to train on the vehicle, and so could not operate it to its somewhat limited potential. If your tank's running out of gas because you haven't yet learned how to fill the fuel tanks correctly, you have a problem. The absolute worst case was the rather hurriedly created 4th DCR. The tanks were delivered without AP ammunition, sights, radios, and sometimes firing pins. The tank commanders for the 4th DCR were all horse cavalrymen, and the drivers were basically given a crash course in training. Okay, that's your pass, go that away. Back over in infantry land, there were still about 2,800 World War I era FTs rolling around, and about 1,000 of them are unarmed because they took the guns off them and they put them into the other 2-man tanks that were replacing them. It's cheaper. When they were pressed into service, oftentimes it's with a light machine gun, or sometimes even the commander had a submachine gun that he'd just stick through the hole in the front. The other 1,445 or so vehicles are split between line units and internal security or airfield security duties. Not much more need be said about the FT. In common with the other 2-man tanks, these were considered to be more or less self-propelled armored artillery, more than tanks that we know today, fairly much in the World War I molds. And speed was not an issue. Armor, however, was an issue, and the FT didn't really have any worthy of the name by the 1930s. And so a search was put on for the replacement. The first attempt is the D1, and this is a fairly odd one in the overall French scheme of things. Basically, this is a super FT by way of the NC series, and the lineage is particularly obvious if you look at the earliest vehicles that were still delivered with FT turrets. Now we've got 3 centimeters of armor, and 18 kilometers an hour speed, and a very reasonable 47mm gun. Not only that, but every tank had a radio and a radio operator. The radio was terrible, but it was better than nothing. Or at least it would have been had the D1 unit actually been allowed to use its radios. They were ordered not to, because they were A, worried that the Germans would be eavesdropping, and B, worried that the Germans would be placing false orders on their frequency. So, like on the S-35, the radio man can also play ersatz loader, which is a little bit more difficult in the D1 because the turret isn't as big as that on the S-35. And inside, the commander is every bit as blind. The D1s are a little bit irrelevant anyway, and they started the war in North Africa. And by the time that they got shipped back to metropolitan France, it was basically mid to late June, and well, the cause was lost anyway. This brings us to the D2, which was developed as a char de bataille, basically a battle tank. Not an infantry tank in the same way as the FT was, and there was some thought going around at the time as to possible other uses of the tank, and again I'll refer you to the doctrine video. There already was a char de bataille under design in the mid-1920s, but there was the possibility that it would become banned in arms reduction talks, and something lighter was required as a backup. So compared to the D1, the D2 added an extra centimeter of armor. The compartment was somewhat rejiggered to put the radio operator up front. It gave it a somewhat more modern look. And better yet, of the 100 D2s built, the majority had been rearmed with the improved 47, the SA-35. It's the same gun found on the Somme S-35. On the downside, we retained the horrible APX turret, made a little bit worse by the height, which means that you kind of had to sort of step onto a stool in order to see out. and then you step off it to see through the gun sight. And a number of the vehicles were caught in mid-upgrade from one gun to the other or conversion to flamethrower tanks. And also, unfortunately, the vehicle was never considered mechanically reliable. More D2s broke down and then were knocked out. There were, of course, the type of tank under the command of Charles de Gaulle, which may perhaps explain some of their effectiveness in the war. But again, relative statement. So in the meantime, Renault has been chewing on the problem a little bit of the two-man infantry support tank, and when the new requirement for the infantry tank was laid out in the early 1930s, it responded with the R35, competing against the H35 and the FCM36. Again, I have a video on the R35, and I struggle to think of a more god-awful piece of crap tank. Now, at least New Zealand had the excuse that they were simply not capable industry-wise of creating a better tank than Bob Simple. The French did not have this excuse. Now, in fairness to the French, for the role that they had in mind, they didn't need a full-up tank. This is more of a self-propelled pillbox to support the infantry. A few tanks did receive an upgrade again to the SA-37 gun, which, again, with the bigger gun and ammo, did not help matters inside the turret. Also, though the armor was officially 4 centimeters thick, Renault hadn't quite mastered the casting process, and in testing, even 25mm could go through more often than not. The vehicle was unbalanced physically, causing excessive wear on the running gear, and had poor cross-country mobility. The eventual fix to this was the R40, of which maybe about 150 of them were built. All told, about 1,300 of the R35 and the R40 were built. Possibly the least worst of the two-man tanks is the FCM36. However, being welded, and thus by skilled craftsmen from FCM, the shipbuilders, it was also very expensive and thus not made in big numbers. The interior is far more tolerable than that of the Renault, and the vision is arguably a little bit better, although that is, again, not saying much. The tank even had what today we would consider to be an NBC overpressure system, and though the diesel engine provided good range, you had the problem that it also required a different form of fuel. Also, although the turret was overall a better design, it was incapable of being upgraded from the SA-18 to the more powerful 37, so that was a bit of a non-starter. The French built about 100 of these tanks, and again, I have a video on it. This thus leaves us now with just the big boys. Speaking of, if you're into trains, Union Pacific got their big boy up and running again. The Char 2C was such a monstrosity that even the French figured out it was a losing proposition and they cut the program. It wasn't the end of the Fortress tank concept. They did muck around with a couple of other prototypes, at least designs and mock-ups, but the 10 2Cs built was all that there was, and they were put into a unit of 8. And so we come to the B1, which arguably is the most overrated tank of the war. Now, to put this tank into perspective, when the prototypes were being built in the mid-1920s, specifically they were delivered about 1924, the Panzer I was 10 years away yet. The British had just introduced into service the medium. This tank is so archaic that it has an honest-to-God engine room. You access it through the doorway at the back of the crew compartment, and there is a passageway through the engine room to the hatch you can get out the back of the tank. If you don't believe me, go check out my video. It's insane. The vehicle got stuck in about 10 years worth of development hell, partially because nobody was sure if the 30-ton tank was going to be legal and not banned by the disarmament conferences, and then because it entered very low rate production. Worse, this was a tank developed without a clear purpose in mind. It was more of a pet project of STM. Now, we certainly had some ideas, like the low gun 75 being designed to shoot through the gun slits and pillboxes and so on. But in terms of doctrine, they hadn't quite figured out what it was for. And despite the long development time, the only deficiencies that were corrected were the armor, to go from the B1 to the B1 bis, and the 47 was improved to the SA-35 from the SA-34. In testing, they realized that the tank was completely blind, but they don't seem to have taken any particular trouble to fix it. Ergonomically, it is absolutely atrocious. The driver's kind of okay, but that's about the end of it. And again, when the tank had a radio, it was absolutely useless. A good line of trees would stop the transmission. Now, the 47mm was good if you could find a target. The 75mm had a pretty hefty bang if the target was obliging enough to stay still for long enough. And the tank is actually not that bad off-road, the ridiculously old-looking track style notwithstanding. And watching it roll around at Tankfest last year, it's actually surprisingly nimble for a bulky old design. And in fairness, the native steering gear is actually quite good, if a little bit quirky. But if you have to have a choice in the Battle of France to be given a company of Matilda 2s or a company of B1s, I can think of almost nothing that the B1 can do better than a Matilda, except maybe lob HE rounds at stationary targets. Plus, like the S-35, these things were being built way too late. Some were delivered incomplete, some without turrets, and the crews didn't really have time to figure out how to use them. Eventually, by doctrine, a role was found in the Division Cuirassée de Réserve, the armoured divisions, but a lack of production capability meant that half of the slots were taken up by H-35s anyway, and the armoured division was really more of a supporting role as part of the methodical battle, not the roles that we would ordinarily think of. There is a bit of a myth that the French threw all their tanks in as penny packets, and this is not true. The armoured divisions were anything but penny packets, and the DLMs, the cavalry divisions, were pretty well organised as well. Now, around this point, somebody is probably furiously typing out, what about Captain Billotte and his run at Stun? After all, this is evidence that this is a powerful vehicle. Well, there's powerful and there's good. Put it this way, Billotte started the day as the company commander of 7 tanks. The attack was going to be of 2 companies and the CO, 15 tanks. Of these 15 tanks that set off towards the direction of Stun, for some reason we only hear about Captain Billotte actually making it to Stun and riding around a little bit. So ask yourself how it came to be, of those 15 tanks, you only hear about the 1 tank, let alone the other 6 that he was supposed to be leading, actually going into Stun. And perhaps you might also ask how many the battalion commander had available the next day. Then ask yourself if the answer to this previous question of why there's only this 1 tank rolling around, is that conducive of a good tank design for winning a war? Was the tank tough? Yeah, sure. Was it any good? Not so much. So now this brings us to the minority partner in the conflict, the UK. And though they were the smallest force, they were also the most modern, and these were the only contingent to start the war completely dependent on petrol and not horses. The British sent 1 armoured car regiment. They had 38 Morris CS9 armoured cars. They were built on a truck chassis, had an open-top turret. They were not very well regarded. They had all of 7mm of armour and carried a Bren light machine gun and a Boy's anti-tank rifle. The Daimler Scout car had just entered service, and a couple of platoons were in France, but these were the very early models and the kinks hadn't yet been worked out. So they were not quite yet the legendary Scout cars that they would become. 7 cavalry regiments each had 28 light tanks Mark VI, making a total of about 200, plus eventually the 1st Armoured Division would land in late May with an additional 125 or so. And as light tanks go, this is one of the best of the bunch, as a 2-man turret and the driver. The design was well developed from previous light tanks, so it was fast, it was pretty reliable, and it usually had a radio. That said, it was still a light tank. It had little armor that was riveted, and it carried a rather unreliable .50 Vickers machine gun. A few vehicles, the Mark 6C, were upgunned to a 15mm and thus quite dangerous to other light armor, but still by 1940 this is not so much of a line combat vehicle. On the other hand, the British did use them fairly intelligently and thus mitigated a lot of their weaknesses. Rounding out the cavalry regiments, each regiment had 44 scout carriers, which is part of the whole Bren or Universal Carrier series of vehicles. And these little guys are some of the most underappreciated vehicles of the war. There's almost 110,000 of the things have been built, making them the most mass-produced armored vehicle ever. You don't build that many vehicles if they are problematic or useless. Now, they had less than half of an inch of armor, and even at that, anybody that they're carrying is only really partially covered, and these are not true APCs as a result. The scout car had a Boyce up front and a Bren on an AA mount at the back, and also they had a radio, 3-man crew. Each infantry battalion had 10 Bren carriers, and it would turn out that in the retreat to Dunkirk, these things were put to sterling use in rearguard actions. They were small, they had the incredibly reliable 85 horsepower Ford V8, which is, for example, more powerful on the 4 centimeter thick armored Hotchkiss H35, and it had a unique track warping steering system, which meant that you could do some routine steering on the road without any loss of power. Also part of the British Expeditionary Force at the off, the 1st Army Tank Brigade, which had 2 regiments, 4 RTR kicked off with 50 Matildas and 5 Mark 6s. 7 RTR provided 27 Matildas and 7 Mark 6s. Now, I decree the R-35 to being the worst heap of rubbish out there, and this is with a caveat, because I have not yet clambered into a Matilda. However, one must observe a few points in Matilda's favour. Firstly, it has half again as much armour, so these things are pretty tough. Secondly, they didn't try to put anything more than a machine gun into it, which means although it's a one-man turret, at least there's hopefully a little bit more room inside. Observation for the TC is certainly far better. For starters, he can stick his head out up at the top, and even if he does duck down, well, he's got a proper periscope, unlike the stupidity of the steel helmet controlled slit domes that the French had. Thirdly, Matildas came with pretty reasonable radio sets, although it was in the hull, and so the TC had to duck down into the hull to operate it, meaning that the turret is unmanned. The real fame came from the 23 Matilda IIs, which filled out the rest of the 7th RTR. 23 Matilda IIs. That's not really very much to stop an invasion. These things have a ridiculous amount of armor, including the suspension, and it took quite a bit of work to knock one of these things out. And again, I've got a series of videos on this particular tank on my channel. With a 4-man crew, driver, and 3 in the turret, this is a tank that provides a reasonable division of labour, even if the turret's a little bit on the cramped side, and the 2-pounder is an excellent gun for the era, at least anti-tank gun, but it did suffer for not having a HE round issued for the tanks, for whatever good a 40mm HE round actually would have been. A few 3-inch close support types might have been present, but the British idea of close support at the time was to lob smoke rounds. It was very easy to drive, although the early style tracks did leave a little bit to be desired on the traction side, and indeed a few vehicles simply mired and had to be destroyed in place. Further, these earlier vehicles proved to be a little unreliable in the engine, steering and transmission departments, somewhat exacerbated by crews who were brand new to the vehicles and the fact that the BEF didn't bring any tank transporters with them, and so they had to drive themselves around all up and down the length of France from the port down as far south as they went, basically Arras. The remainder of the British Armoured Force is basically the 1st Armoured Division, recently stood up as a unit. Again, go over see the Doctor video. They did show up with some tank transporters, but they also showed up a little late. All told, in addition to the aforementioned Mark 6 lights, the division's 6 regiments between them would have tallied about 24 cruiser A9s, 18 A10s, and 140 A13s. These tanks were, generally speaking, good designs, poorly executed. All 3 of the cruisers are fairly closely related, and I do have a video tour of the A10 up on the channel. The A9 is the daft one of the bunch. With armour not much more than a light tank, about half an inch, this cruiser had the merit of a large 3-man turret with either a 2-pounder or the 3-inch howitzer. It had the rugged, slow-motion suspension, and the AEC engine, 150 horsepower, was considered quite reliable as well. And all told, the tank had a reasonable speed of about 25 miles an hour. On the downside, in addition to the light armour, The genius in charge decided that there needed to be 2 machine gun turrets on the front, one on either side of the driver in the front hull. This makes it a 6-man tank. Coordination of fire is problematic, and let us not bother discussing the shot trap and up-armoring problems. The up-armored tank, the A-10, was up-armored to about 3 centimeters, so it's more or less equal, at least in theory, to the panzers that it would be facing. And indeed there was greater use of sloping of the armor plate. On the other hand, the plate was bolted to an internal structure, thus reducing effectiveness and increasing overall weight. The turret is roomy, well equipped with communications gear, it had a power traverse, and again came with a good 2-pounder gun, or the 3-inch. Unfortunately, the extra weight of the armor dropped the tank's speed to a paltry 16 miles an hour, which rather killed it for the cruiser role. So this brings us to the A-13s, cruisers Mark III and IV. These are, in theory, excellent tanks. Again, we have the large 3-man turret complete with a cupola of sorts for the TC. They are very fast, and they introduced a Christie suspension that the British would use for the rest of the war. At 30 miles an hour, they could in theory outpace a Panzer III, and with a better gun and equivalent armor, they could in theory outshoot a Panzer III. They all have radios, supposedly. First Armour did suffer some of the same problems that the French were suffering from, with rush production leading to the fielding of incomplete tanks. Some of them didn't have radios, some of them didn't have sights, some didn't have ammunition. Although at least that could be, I guess, traded off. The troubles continued. The armour on the Mark III was again barely half an inch. And that said, though, there was an up-armouring program to bring them more or less up to the same standards as the Mark IV, and you can see photographs of both of them in France. Instead of the rugged AEC engine, they went back to the World War I era Liberty engine, which had over twice the horsepower and about twice or more the unreliability. Also unreliable, the clutch, the steering gear. The tracks, again, lacked traction, and particularly in the wet, they tended also to come apart very frequently at the slightest excuse. Even the tow ropes that they were equipped with were not up to the task. So yet again, we have a case of a tank which just doesn't match up in reality to what the paper specifications say they should. Unfortunately for the British, these tanks would continue to see service in North Africa. On the plus side, the British did have a mobile professional force which understood the need for rapid communications, rapid decision, and they had excellent leadership. But all that would be useless if they happened to be caught out of place. So anyway, that is the armour as it is arrayed between the two sides. May the best, or the luckiest, team win.
I'm Indy Nidell, and this is another World War II On Location special, and part of our road trip to France, 1940. There is a popular belief that France's defeat in the German invasion in 1940 was caused by an inferior army or inferior equipment or a retreat in the face of an overwhelmingly superior enemy. But a large part of the blame for France's defeat was caused by willful politicians and command failure. Okay, so where are we, Richard?
Well, we're on Block 2 of Maginot Line Ouvrage La Ferté.
It is underneath us.
La Ferté is a petit ouvrage, one of 5 ouvrages intended to be built for the new front in the mid-30s. The probable reason to attack this ouvrage was for the propaganda benefit of capturing a Maginot Line ouvrage in the first week of the combat. German High Command was so happy with this, they allocated something like up to 240 artillery pieces for the attack. Which
Just this little
ouvrage
not
of
a
2
city.
blocks.
It's not Leningrad.
That's right. These are anti-tank rails which were put in position by the German army immediately after the armistice, because this was used for propaganda purposes to show how the Germans had defeated the Maginot Line. And there were visitors, both soldiers and officers, all the way through the Second World War, and it's one of the most photographed Maginot Line ouvrages. So in effect, the first tourists here were German soldiers.
German soldiers. What actually happened to the Frenchmen in here?
Well, this is the sad part of the story. All 107 men died.
All of them?
Every man died. So explaining it, the Germans, the mechanized units left Germany morning of the 10th. It took them the 10th, the 11th, the 12th, and the beginning of the 13th for them to move from Germany to the east to the far horizon, which is Sedan. On the 13th of May, the 2nd, 1st and 10th Panzer Divisions with Infantry Regiment Grossdeutschland attacked at Sedan. They broke through across the river. Following the mechanised units, the 71st German 71st Infantry Division marched and on the 14th arrived at the town of Carignan, which is the town, not the little village below us, but the town.
Town there, okay.
So that's to say that the mechanised units were not going significantly faster than infantry marching. When the 71st Infantry Division arrived at Carignan, General Hunziger, who was the commander from Sedan to the other side of this village called Villy, ordered the withdrawal from the Maginot Line from the other side of this village all the way to Sedan on the night of the 14th, 15th of May. Because it was occupied primarily by Regiment Infantry de Fortress, they had no transport. So they had to abandon all their heavy equipment and most of their ammunition, and they withdrew back into the wooded hills behind us. The morning of the 15th of May, the commander of the German 71st Infantry Division did his attack across the river Cher. They were in the valley of the Cher. Artillery bombardment, attacked across the river, no French resistance, because the Maginot Line had been abandoned under the orders of General Hunziger. So on advancing up and capturing the village of Villy, holding the high ground behind, there's the river to the east. It meant the ouvrage was isolated. The original plan had been for 10 minutes Stuka attack on this block, 30 minutes of artillery bombardment by up to 240 artillery pieces. While that's going on, the German combat engineers would work as close as they could to the edge of the bombardment. Then German 88 direct fire weapons would fire across the valley at this cloche, and you can see some hits on the cloche. The idea being to blind the ouvrage. While the 88s were firing, the German combat engineers would creep as close to the craters, as close to the actual block as possible. When they were in position, they'd fire a flare pistol, Very pistol. The 88s would stop, they ran up, and they placed charges on the other side of the cloche. And you can see to the left where they've attached the 40 kilos of explosive, and when they set that off, that lifted the turret up a metre and it dropped back approximately in the position you see it now. And that's why you see the turret disabled like this.
Had Hunziger not withdrawn his men, would it have been as easy to destroy this?
Oh no, if the French army has spent 10 years building the Maginot Line here, and there's the usual casemates, there's all the blockhouses that would normally be there, there are observation posts. Had it been manned, it should have been able to resist a German infantry division attack for, it's debatable, we don't know how long, but it should have been able to resist it, yes. Originally, the ouvrage was intended to have 3 blocks. Only 2 blocks were built. This plan indicates, top right, that block 1 should have had 2 levels, and that block 2 should have had 2 levels. But when we go inside, we will see that block 1 does indeed have 2 levels, but block 1, only 1 level was constructed, which has contributed to why the ouvrage fell.
Why was it such a disaster so quickly?
So what happened was, there is no separation of function. This is a combat area, it's a cloche, it fires. That's where the men sleep. There are 50 men in this block.
Wow.
There's no separation between the men sleeping, living down below protected, and the combat area where the fighting is. So when there were the explosive charges dropped down from the cloche above, the explosive charges destroyed this wall. This hole, this gaping hole, where there should have been a wall with the concrete on the floor, this is not a structural wall. This wall is only here to keep this part in overpressure.
Right.
so that any gases are pushed out. So when there were explosions here, this wall just disintegrated, and in fact you can see how it must have injured some of the men lying on the beds, and straight away there were explosions, there's fire, because the fuel required for the motors was just stacked all over the place, because there was no place to store it underground. So it just went catastrophically wrong in seconds or minutes.
Now, the Germans couldn't have known that this one wasn't set. So it was just luck that they picked it.
It was kind of bad luck, yeah. Okay. The Germans didn't know, no. The men had to abandon the block and go down into the gallery, those that were not injured or dead. You can see the effects of the blast from the explosions that's deformed the wall. When the attack was repeated by the Germans in Block 1, again they had to all go down, those that were not injured or dead, into the gallery. There's only a gallery, kitchen and infirmary, and there's not fresh air supplied to the gallery. The Germans say they found most bodies in the French word is the aigu, it's the drain. It's like a long gallery, 75-metre gallery, which then goes into the drainage, the siphons. And the reason they would have found French soldiers there is because it's 75 metres long, there's a volume of fresh air until that's used up. So gradually, as more and more explosions, more and more fires, there was less and less oxygen, and they died through lack of oxygen and noxious gases. After the armistice, the local teacher asked the Germans if he could disinter the bodies that the Germans had buried. The Germans said yes. He disinterred the bodies, found about 80-odd bodies, tried to identify those that he could. They could not identify the commander of the ouvrage, Lieutenant Bourguignon. So all through the war, there were rumours that Bourguignon handed the fort over to the Germans. After the war, Bourguignon's son did everything he could to try and find out what happened. So he put messages, he put letters, adverts, did everything he could in German military magazines, newspapers, whatever. And it wasn't until 1973 he got a reply from a German soldier who said he was here with the penal units that had buried the French bodies, and he said, yes, we buried 80-odd there, and yes, we buried another bunch here. Okay. And so Bourguignon's son got permission from the French state to disinter this second group of soldiers, and they found 18 bodies, one of which was his father. So that's when his father was identified as being a hero who had died with his men, and he had Légion d'honneur, etc. And that's what that memorial there is for.
All right, that's all for today. Once again, thank you very much, Richard Tucker.
My pleasure.
As always, it is our pleasure to have you here showing us around, and I hope you guys enjoyed that. Now, you can find the link to his website below, and check him out on TripAdvisor, so whenever you're in this part of France, or southern Belgium, or any of the Benelux countries, you can come and check this out, and he'll show you around, and it'll be absolutely amazing. And please, support us on Patreon so we can make more trips like this in the future. Don't forget to subscribe. See you next time. I'm not making it up. Why would I make it up? No, that is what happened. All right. May 25th, 1940. You have plans for your war, but your enemy attacks you in a way no one has before. He has broken through your lines, and a whole army is in danger of being surrounded. Confusion reigns, and if you have some bad luck, the whole situation could become, in some ways, a black comedy farce. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Netherlands surrendered to the invading Germans. The French fought well in Belgium at the Battle of Hainaut, but had to withdraw because the German breakthrough at Sedan further south left them exposed. That breakthrough was spectacular indeed, and by the end of the week, German panzers were streaming west across northern France. There were other things that happened last week that I did not have time to cover, so I will get to them first. In Norway back on the 12th, French foreign legionnaires, supported by naval guns, landed near Bjerkvik. they managed to take it under heavy fire, capture Elvegårdsmoen with hand-to-hand combat, and reach the southern tip of Øyjord Peninsula, a springboard for an attack on Narvik. Meanwhile, German General Feuerstein's 2nd Gebirgsdivision is advancing north from Trondheim, 1,200 kilometers, to relieve the German forces in Narvik. On the 13th, Claude Auchinleck assumes command of the Allied land forces there. The Allies now see that if they take Narvik, in order to hold it, they will also have to hold the town Boda to prevent the Germans from coming from Trondheim. However, because of the German success in France and Belgium, the Allies reassess their commitment to Norway. This week, they first recommend Narvik be captured before a total evacuation, but then tell Auchinleck to leave as soon as possible and to attack Narvik to cover the evacuation and to deny the Germans future iron supplies by wrecking the port. His operations are at a standstill, though, because he's waiting for proper air support to be established at Bardufoss. They get their first complement of aircraft the 24th, and the campaign, now in its final stages, is suddenly a lot less one-sided and shows what might have been done earlier. In Britain on the 18th, American Tyler Kent and Russian Anna Volkov are arrested as spies. Kent, a clerk in the US Embassy in London, has access to correspondence between British Prime Minister Winston Churchill and American President Franklin Roosevelt, and Volkov has been passing it to Germany through Italian diplomats. She is a member of the Right Club, a pro-fascist organization. Now this week, Captain Ramsey, MP, is detained, also a Right Club member, and on the 23rd, Oswald Mosley is arrested. He is a former member of Parliament and founder and leader of the British Union of Fascists. There was a notable death in China last week. On the 16th, Chinese General Zhang Zhixiang dies in North Hubei, resisting the Japanese. According to Hans van de Ven, further reports declared that when Zhang died, he had been leading an attack, had suffered wounds to his arms and chest, but had refused to be taken behind the lines. He is, and will be, the most senior Chinese general to die in this war, and the only army commander to die on the field while directing his army. The Japanese give him a respectful burial. The Chinese nationalists will recover his remains and bring them to Chongqing, the capital, where they will be welcomed by Chiang Kai-shek. Zhang's heroic status will grow to cult status in future. Back on the 13th, the Chinese 33rd Army Group reaches Tongbaishang and cuts Japanese communications for several days. But the main part of that group had been encircled by the Japanese in the Dahong foothills, and it was there that Zhang is killed. By the beginning of this week, the Chinese think the Japanese are pulling back to their original bases and pursue them, but only on a very narrow front. So a Japanese counterattack pushes back the Chinese. After that, Part 2 of the battle for Yichang begins, with the Japanese planning to root out and destroy the Chinese still in the Dahong Mountains, take Yichang itself, and secure Changchi. That's the plan. And there are plans afoot all over the place. This week, the Soviets, who already have a military presence in the Baltic states, are, not so subtly to the world at large, preparing for a full takeover, staging local conflicts. For example, the Soviet government accuses Lithuania of kidnapping Soviet soldiers. In Germany, Admiral Erich Raeder mentions to Adolf Hitler for the first time that it might be necessary to invade Britain. And in Britain itself, Parliament passes the Emergency Powers Act, giving the government great power over British people and property. But what about the active war in Europe? As the week begins, the British invasion of Iceland is complete, but the German one of France and the Benelux countries continues. On the 19th, most German armor is stopped to regroup between Péronne and Saint-Quentin. Charles de Gaulle's French 4th Armored Division tries again to attack the Germans north from around Lyon. He makes progress this time, but is soon ordered to pull back. That same day, in telephone conversations between London and the British field commanders, the possibility that they may need to evacuate the continent is raised for the first time. On the 20th, the German armor advances again. Amiens falls in the morning, and Abbeville in the evening. Advanced units even reach the coast at Noyelles. Germany now has a corridor, at least 20 miles wide, that's 32 kilometers, from the Ardennes to the Channel. Now, The obvious thing that the Allies must do at all costs is break through this corridor before its walls can be fortified, since that would totally cut off all the Allied forces to the north. French commander Maurice Gamelin was planning something like that, but he was replaced last week, and his replacement Maxime Weygand now revives the plan, but the delay imposed by the dismissal and appointment gives it only really a slim chance of success. Weygand wants to attack the German flanks from the north and south near Arras, where the line is thinnest, to break up the encirclement of Belgium and northeastern France. So the next day, the British attack Erwin Rommel's division around Arras. This attack begins very well, because the British Matilda tanks are semi-invulnerable to German anti-tank guns. After a minor panic, the Germans do stop the attack with some 88 guns, and since the British force has no air support and is quite small, the attack cannot continue. That day, the 21st, Weygand sets off in the morning to try and organize a really big combined counterattack. This is the day where it descends into the realm of farce. Weygand waits for 2 hours at Le Bourget for a plane and then flies to Bethune, but finds it deserted except for one soldier who drives Weygand to a post office so he can call Gaston Billotte, commander of the French First Army Group in northern France and Belgium, who has himself just spent hours looking for Weygand near Calais. So Weygand then flies on to Calais, but only after eating an omelette at a country inn. On the wall is a picture of the signing of the 1918 armistice. Weygand, of course, is in that picture, standing with Ferdinand Foch. So Weygand gets to Calais, but can't find Billotte, but gets a message that Belgian King Leopold wants to meet him and Billotte in Ypres. His car then crawls through refugee-crowded roads for a few hours to Ypres, where 3 meetings happen. First, Weygand meets King Leopold. Weygand wants him to have his army retreat to the west to shorten the Allied line and allow the Allies a southern attack. Leopold is against giving up so much Belgian territory and thinks his men can't really take much more fighting and says he needs Lord Gort's opinion first. Gort is the commander of the British Expeditionary Force and does not know about this meeting. So Billotte then arrives and has a meeting with Weygand. Billotte, according to all accounts, has by this time already given up hope for the French. He does, though, think that the British could launch an attack. So Weygand asks Leopold to shorten the line to allow the British to attack with Belgian assistance. Leopold can maybe go for this, but still wants to talk to Gort. Weygand leaves, and Gort then finally arrives on the scene for a third meeting. He is a bit skeptical of the BEF's ability to do such an attack as proposed, though he does not refuse it. By the time Weygand gets to Paris, though, he thinks Gort not turning up at Ypres is a deliberate snub, which it is not. And also, by this time, Billotte is in a coma from a car wreck and will die 2 days later without awakening. And for a couple of days, there is no one to give orders to the French First Army Group. All during this time, the German army and armor are streaming through the gaping hole in the Allied lines. On the 22nd, the Germans at the coast turn to the north and make for Boulogne and Calais. Also the 22nd, Weygand meets with Churchill and French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud and says that General Aubert Frere's army of nearly 20 divisions will do the counterattack from the south, break through, and link up with the BEF to the north. Frere is assembling south of the Somme, but in reality has around 6 divisions stretched over 100 kilometers. The 23rd, Churchill hears that Gort's position is vulnerable. He's also told, though, that Frere has taken Amiens. This is great news, though totally untrue. Still, if believed, it makes an attack southward worth doing. But that night, Gort decides to withdraw his men from the exposed salient near Arras. He is not abandoning the attack plan, just recognizing the reality of the situation and moving parallel to the coast, not toward it. But many French think they are being abandoned. Weygand now thinks there will be no attack southward, even while Gort and Georges Blanchard, who takes over from the deceased Billotte, discuss the actual details of the attack. Finally, at 6 p.m. on the 25th, as the week ends, Gort calls off his part. The Germans have broken through the Belgians near Courtrai on the Luce, and Gort has to head north to plug the gap to keep open a route to Dunkirk on the Channel coast. On the coast now, though, even though the Germans have attacked both Boulogne and Calais, Boulogne falls at the end of the week, the main German armored force is ordered to halt the 24th, an order confirmed by Hitler. They have reached a line from Bethune to Gravelines, and sure, it's not great terrain for armor, but the Allied defenses are weak here. David Somerville writes, "The pause, which lasts until the morning of the 27th, gives the French and British time to strengthen this position, and is generally seen as being the move which makes the evacuation of the BEF possible. The motives for Hitler's decision can only be guessed." Now, there are several possible reasons for this order, which I will go into next week in detail. Here is how this week ends in the field. Gort, as I said, cancels the preparations he's made to join Weygand's offensive. Weygand will cancel the whole thing, blaming Gort. But the French forces on the Somme have not, despite claims to the contrary, made any attacks. So, the Germans have stopped advancing for the time being, China loses a general in the field, the Allies are going to leave Norway, and there is chaos and confusion among the Allied high command in Western Europe. Well, there is chaos and confusion in the general population as well. I mean, what do the French people think of all this? This lightning invasion and breakthrough? In Paris, there is just plain disbelief at first. But when the truth sets in, so does panic. And all over northern France begins a mass flight of civilians. And this seriously damages both military communications and morale in general. Think, northeastern France was occupied for 4 years in World War I, and the people there damn sure don't want to go through that again. Lille has 200,000 inhabitants. 90% of them leave. Just 800 people remain of 23,000 in Chartres, and the French army is trying to move and maneuver amid this ocean of humanity. And how tough do you think that is? I'm going to end with this. In the month after the invasion began, 8 million people leave their homes, the largest mass migration in Western European history. People forcibly removed from their homes, or people who feel they have to leave them. This is not a new thing in times of war. But the first half of the 20th century is perhaps the pinnacle for this. For an earlier forced mass exodus, check out the Greco-Turkish War in our Between Two Wars series right here. Our Time Ghost member of the week is Robbie Rached. Oh, hi Robbie. I've met Robbie actually. Well, Robbie, you and the rest of the forces are literally the only people keeping this show afloat. So to those of you who haven't, join us on timeghost.tv or patreon.com. Subscribe, activate notifications. See you next time. But I don't see how they're going to do it. No, I mean, they don't even have that many boats. All right, Winston. Okay. June 1st, 1940. It is a name that most of you know from movies or television, and it is in fact one of the most famous locations of the whole war. The main action there begins this week, Dunkirk. I'm Indy Nidell. This is World War II. Last week, the Allies decided they will end the Norway campaign and retire from Narvik, though the British completed their invasion of Iceland. General Zhang Zizhong was killed in action in China, and in the war in Western Europe, the Germans advanced for much of the week before being ordered to halt the 24th. Allied plans for a counterattack were scrapped, and there were hundreds of thousands of refugees in northern France. As this week begins, Calais surrenders to the Germans. The British begin to fall back towards Dunkirk, and evacuation is ordered, and the Belgian army is in dire straits. That day, the 26th, the patrol ship A4 arrives in Plymouth, with the last of the 40 tons of gold evacuated from Belgium. On the 28th, Belgian King Leopold agrees to surrender his army, but without consulting the Allies or his government, who are in Paris. This goes into effect at 11 a.m., and only by a desperate redeployment do the British and French manage to keep the Germans from reaching Newport and the Dunkirk beaches. The French and British are livid for not being consulted beforehand. But you know, it's not like they've been consulting the Belgians the past few weeks about military stuff. British Expeditionary Force Commander Lord Gort didn't tell them that he was pulling back to the coast, and the Belgians are angry themselves that they haven't recently gotten more military assistance. As Julian Jackson points out in The Fall of France, the German attack near Courtrai at the end of last week went across the British front, and those British troops, who had not been assigned to the then-planned counteroffensive, could have tried to attack the German flanks, but that didn't